Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with Randy Blazak, who is an expert in extremism. Thanks for joining me today, Randy. So, the deaf community had asked me how we met. We initially met at a class at university, and we had a lot of good conversations. And Carla Schroeder was part of that discussion and presentation. And we worked together on the hate crime law in 2012. So,
Right. Yes.
we've known each other for quite a long time.
Yes. And you have been very helpful in helping me to understand how to be a better professor and communicator for my deaf students. There was much I didn't think about as a hearing person, and so you really opened my eyes and my mind in how to better serve the deaf community. So thank you for that, Jason.
Absolutely, you're welcome. And likewise, I remember the first day of class, I was ready to have tough conversations with you. And you had, I think the first assignment was to write a 25-page paper. And some people couldn't stand it, walked right out of class, but I stayed and I'm so glad I did because I learned a lot from you.
Yeah, that class is very intense. It's not for the weak.
Absolutely. Yeah. Analyzing human vulnerabilities and humanity and understanding that human frailty, that is definitely intense. It's not for the weak. And so you really helped me to understand what that meant and how to analyze that for myself.
Right.
So we're here to talk about the DEIA issues that are happening in the world today: diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. You are a hearing person and you come with that frame, and I'm a deaf person and I come with my perspective. And so I think the first question is, how does that color your worldview? How does being a hearing person color your worldview?
That's a very good question because it is defined as normal. Like, there is an idea about what is normal and what deviates from the norm, and much of our world is shaped by this concept of normal. And so anything that's different from that, the people who are defined as normal don't have to pay attention to it. It's something extra. And so one of the things I've learned in doing this work is that there is much of my world that is experienced very differently by other people. And part of that is understanding people with various disabilities, including around the issue of hearing, that sometimes I don't think about. So a good example would be how much we talk about music in our world, how much a part of music is a part of the way that we communicate, the way that we interact with each other. And I remember one moment where I was posting something on Facebook. I post a lot about the music I listen to, and I had a friend who was a music writer who was also part of the conversation. And Jason posted, "Why is music so important to you?" And his immediate response was, "What's wrong with you? Are you crazy? How can you not know why music is important?" And I told my friend, his name is Tony, you might not know this, but my friend is deaf, and you, being a music writer, would be the perfect person to explain why music is so important. But it just didn't cross his mind that someone would post on a discussion about music without hearing the music the same way that he and I do. And it was a very aha moment, a little light bulb went off on my head because I realized I take so much for granted in the way we interact that's based on the idea that we can hear each other. Do you remember that, Jason?
I do. I remember that very vividly. And I remember just my comment of why it was so important really started off a whole discussion.
Right.
So it was interesting for us to both see each other's perspective. And I sometimes people respond differently to my questioning because they're not used to having those beliefs of normality questioned.
Right.
So you have 40 years experience in understanding extremism. Can you talk to us a little bit about what extremism is? What does that mean?
Well, it's a very good discussion, and it's often subjective. There are some people who think, um, for example, the president of the United States, Mr. Trump, has said that protesting Tesla is extremism. He wants to define it as domestic terrorism. I would not see it that way, but there are things that I see as extremism that other people might see as uh, a mainstream political position. So it's a very subjective concept. And the easiest way to think about the notion of political extremism is using our political spectrum. That we have this notion of the right wing and the left wing of the political spectrum, that the right is more conservative, the left is more liberal, and we're kind of in the middle of that spectrum. And then the things that are just beyond the middle, on the right and the left, are often defined by us as extremism. But since it is a spectrum, it's sliding. So if I'm moving more to the conservative end, I might see liberalism as extreme. And if I'm moving more towards the conservative side, uh, if I'm moving more to the liberal side, I might see conservatives as extreme. So it's a very relative concept. But the thing that is important to think about in this moment we're in now is political extremism, especially right wing political extremism, is really about preserving the status quo. The status quo of what is defined as normal. So that's straight, white, cisgendered, able bodied, heterosexual men. Their world has been challenged by the civil rights movement, by work to be more inclusive and more equitable. Their world is no longer their world. It's now our world. And so much of the extremism is trying to redefine what is normal. We keep coming back to this idea of what is normal. So I think a lot of the extremism we see now in 2025 is about the people who have been challenged by the civil rights movement, including the able bodied community, wanting to wrestle control back so they have control and they have power. And that's what is driving much of the anti DEI rhetoric now is people who don't want to talk about transgender issues or don't want to talk about access issues or don't want to talk about women's rights or Black Lives Matters. They want to go back to a time when they held the space and could let other people in as they wanted instead of the door being open to everybody. So I think that's a very general picture of what's happening right now is that they see it as a pendulum that swung too far in the woke direction, and they're trying to push it back closer to where they held the power. And society is never a straight line, so we're often going forward, going back, going forward, going back. But there is a big pushback now. And the the fear is that the gains made by all the civil rights communities, including the disability community and the trans community and women, is being undone. It's being pushed back. And a lot of the progress we made in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement to make the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion and access more mainstream are being erased.
Absolutely. And I think the status quo, challenging the status quo is so important. We think about what the status quo has been. The status quo doesn't necessarily mean freedom and happiness for everyone. For
Right.
some of us, it means this dark cloud hanging over us. And so I think that status quo concept actually leads into my next question. And my next question is, how does extremism, particularly the right wing extremism, feeding fear and hate, including attacking deaf rights and people with disabilities rights? You know, President George H.W. Bush signed the ADA into law in 1990, and a few days later, the Hate Crime Statistics Act was added. So, what is feeding that fear today?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. I think the general answer is the feeling of rapid change. There is this term from a very famous founder of sociology named Durkheim, who you might remember, called anomie, anomie, anomie. It's a French term meaning the sense of normlessness, not normalness, but normlessness. And it refers to when there is rapid change, when things happen very quickly, and the rules that we've had that that help us make it through the day, including the informal customs that we have, change very quickly. And so, in the last 50 or 60 years, there's been incredible change. If we think of most societies go for hundreds of years with very little change, in the last half century, we've changed dramatically. And a lot of those changes have been around gender. Just for example, the use of pronouns is something very new for a lot of people, or thinking about gender as different from sex is very new for a lot of people, or how to respond to the presence of people with varying disabilities in our communities. As you know, in the past, we warehoused people with disabilities. We removed them from view. We put them in hospitals or asylums or varying places to keep them out of view. People did not have access to even enter buildings 50 years ago until the ADA was signed. And so this change, while is very exciting and welcoming, and it means there are more people in our community, for some people it's very upsetting. So the phrase "Make America Great Again," that popular phrase, for a lot of people means going back to a time where I understood the rules, where I understood about gender, where I understood about people in wheelchairs, where I understood about people who weren't white. And so everything had its place. And now all those rules have changed. So the good news is younger people understand this. They've grown up in this diverse environment and they understand the variety of people in our community. But the older people who have a lot of power, they have the power in the media, the power in politics, the power in the economy, um, understand that there are a lot of Americans who are nervous about all this change. So a perfect example of this now is how the use of the word woke has been weaponized. How being empathetic, caring about other people, and wanting to open doors for people who have been excluded is now seen as a bad thing, and it's just used as a put down, as a slur. That this is woke and that's woke. Uh, that value is supposed to be an American value. We're supposed to want to open doors for people, but for the people who are nervous and unsettled by this rapid change, saying someone is woke is a way to say there's been too much change, and I want to go back to a time that makes sense to me. So I think the answer to your question, Jason, is, even though it's a very complex problem, is that part of it is just things change so quickly for some people, and they don't know how to navigate it. They're worried about looking like a bigot or looking like a racist. They're worried that there are things they can't say anymore. I think a good example of this is in comedy, how comedy has changed, how the things that were funny in the 1980s are now problematic. A lot of the things I laughed at it when I was in college, now I just shake my head and I think, how could that be seen as funny? Because the change has been so quick. Um, I have the brain power to say, actually, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But some people say, "Oh, I can't say anything anymore, and I want to go back." So I think the best answer to your question is that the rapid pace of change really unsettles some people, and the bigotry is kind of a pushback against all that change.
It's funny you mentioned comedy, actually. You remember Lisa Lampanelli,
Yes.
one of the queens of comedy, and
Oh,
she was the roast queen. I think in
yeah,
2007, maybe, she actually made fun of deaf people at a comedy place in New York. And, people actually laughed. People laughed at that. But to
yeah,
look at that same comedy today, that would never be appropriate today.
right.
And to add to that, too, are you familiar with the ugly laws?
No.
So back in the 40s, there were a set of laws across the country, California being one of the first, called ugly laws. I believe 9 states had these set of laws. So if you went into a public restaurant or public bar and you were considered ugly, meaning you were not normal, you were disabled, you were deaf, you had some sort of other disability, you would be covered by these ugly laws and you would not be allowed in. And actually, the last of those laws was taken off the books in 74 in Chicago.
Wow.
But people could simply call and say, this person is violating the ugly law, and the police would come arrest you. Would you consider that extremism or extreme?
Well, it would be a form of historic discrimination. I mean, if you look at the history of how we discriminate, it's often about proximity, about closeness. So if you think about bathrooms or drinking fountains or sitting on the bus, it's about how we allow people who we define as not normal. This could include Black people or gay people or any group that's defined as not normal. How close we allow them to the normal group. And so those types of laws around barring people with disabilities are part of keeping people at a distance. And so again, how we would warehouse the mentally ill, for example, as a way of keeping them out of sight, out of mind. The segregation laws were meant to keep people away from the normal population. And it's always about this distance. And the value behind this is always dehumanizing. It's about dehumanizing a population of people. This is the origin of the slave trade and dehumanizing Africans, of dehumanizing queer people or dehumanizing uh, Mexican people. There is this value that somehow there's something about them that makes them less than the dominant group, white people in this case, and therefore they must be kept separate from.
So I think that's an important word to take a second and talk a little bit about dehumanization. I've read a couple of really good books. I can't remember the title right now on dehumanization. I wish I could remember the title, but I'll put that in the references. But I would really encourage people in the deaf community to read up on what that means and our history with dehumanization. Now, another question I had for you is, can you talk a little bit about the us versus them paradigm? And for those people who believe in the hateful peaks, like for example, the pyramid of hate, so people who believe they deserve space, power, and
Yeah.
respect. I don't know how to put a picture of the pyramid of hate here necessarily in Zoom, but I can give some examples like prejudiced attitudes,
Hmm.
acts of prejudice, discrimination, violence, and genocide. Could you talk a little bit about the pyramid of hate?
Sure, there is a continuum of hate that goes from simple not liking a particular population to wanting to annihilate them and remove them from the planet. And they are connected. They aren't disconnected from each other. So a bias about a group of people that could just be an attitude. I don't like the people on that side of the hill uh, in the right conditions, can move all the way up the pyramid to genocide, where you get people who are purposely trying to remove that population from the planet. And so one of the reasons we talk about this pyramid is because it's easy to write off a racist comment or an ableist joke and say, well, it's just a comment. It's a microaggression. It's a small thing. Don't get so upset. It's not the Nazis. But in the right conditions, those attitudes turn into behavior like discrimination. That would be at the next level up. And then they become violence, hate crimes, and then they become genocide. So it's important to pay attention to not just the extreme um, Nazi Germany. We always use that as the extreme, but the underlying attitudes that allow us to get to genocide. So that pyramid is really good. And then part of it, you mentioned the kind of us versus them thinking. This is a big part of it, and it's a big part of the work that I do now, is how we are trained to think in what we call the binary, the black and white, up and down, right and left. Everything is sort of one side or the other. So, for example, there is a large discussion now that there are two genders, that gender is a binary. Uh, Sex is somewhat of a binary, although there are a lot of people who are born intersex. About 1 in 1,000 births are intersex, people born with both male and female genitalia. So even sex isn't really a perfect binary. But gender certainly is not a binary. But there's a lot of people who can't think outside of this one side or the other. You're male or you're female. You're abled or you're disabled. That's another binary. There's a whole host of, as you know, different types of disabilities, including ones people can see, ones that they can't see, ones that are temporary, ones that are permanent, ones that are experienced lifelong, and ones that are temporary. In 2002, I had a stroke and a brain hemorrhage, and I could not walk for 3 months. And then it was a period of learning how to walk again, and for me, that was a temporary disability, but it gave me sort of empathy into the people who can't walk every day. I had a chance to get better, and become more mobile. And so this notion of you're on one side or the other side is very problematic because we are many things. Even a better example is the notion of race. Race is such a human construct. There are no people that are white that are color white, or no people that are black that are color black. We're all varying shades of skin tone, and there is uh, a need for some people to put you in one box or the other. So if you think in the South, especially after the Civil War, the concern about race mixing, that was a term that was used to create the mulatto. Someone who destroyed the color line was very problematic because you're either white or you're black. You can't have anything that's in between. So it's a problematic way that we have been trained since we're kids. We grow up with ideas of good and evil. We read comic books and watch movies where there's the very good guys and the very bad guys. If you're a fan of Marvel comics, you know that sometimes the good guys have some bad things about them, and sometimes the bad guys can be redeemable. There is this complexity, but we actually have done brain scans on people, and know that there are some people who are more challenged by going beyond the binary. They're challenged by the complexity of reality. They're challenged by nuance and context and all these things that we use to sort of make sense of a very complicated world. They want to see you're good or you're bad. You're either on one team or the other team. And reality doesn't work that way. But that binary allows people to hate the other. And in fact, there is no other. There's just us.
Absolutely. And I think that us is really important because, like you said, kids learn in the binary, and we're seeing a lot more of that where kids are exposed at a young age to that hate and that bigotry, and they're developing that binary mindset. But there is no binary. As you said, there is only us. The other important thing is to talk about is higher education, as you and I both know. And what we've seen recently is the right wing politicians attacking higher education and working to oppress certain groups within higher education to take away freedoms. For example, Gallaudet University just last week was recently threatened by President Trump that they were not allowed to have any student protests. And that's a threat to Gallaudet because Gallaudet does receive federal funding. And so they're twisting words saying you may not have any illegal protests, but not defining what that is. And so taking away then the students' freedom of speech. So my question is to you, we've seen deaf people attacked throughout history. And we remember our true history that in the past, the universities during the Nazi regime used eugenic experimentation for able-bodied or hearing supremacy to ignore process and equity. I'm curious your take on how we're seeing that happen with extremism today.
Yeah, two thoughts really quickly. First of all, about the attacks on higher education. One of the pillars of fascism is to be anti-intellectual, to target people who focus on high ideas and analysis and the things that would happen at universities. The first targets in the Third Reich were not Jewish shop owners, but were university professors. So going after the intellectual class and those who are developing the skills to understand how things work, it is a part of authoritarianism, and I think we're seeing a version of that now. I mean, the joke is that we're in an idiocracy, which is the name of a film about America 500 years in the future. It turns out it's happening now. So there is that issue. I think that's happening and that's why universities are our target because people are developing the skills to be critical of the status quo. So they're just like in the 1930s, the universities are going to be a target in the 2020s. The other thing about the ableism that's woven into this, Jason, as you're talking to me, I'm reminded of an experience I had 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. I was just finishing my work in Ukraine, and where I was helping to bring refugees out to Poland. And on my last day in Poland, uh, I went to Auschwitz. I went to the Auschwitz camp, and I thought I've read about this place. I've lectured about this place. I've written about it. I need to go to this place to see it in person, and it was a devastating experience. I think I had a panic attack when I walked under the gates. But one of the, and I'm going to be emotional talking about this. Besides that initial recognition that this is real, this really happened, and it's a huge complex. One of the first places we walked into, one of the first buildings we walked into, is where people with disabilities were brought in, and there was a room full of crutches, artificial limbs, wheelchairs, anything that a person with a disability in the 1930s or 40s would need to survive in a huge pile because they were immediately put to death. There was no ability to get them to do the slave labor that they need. So people with disabilities were immediately exterminated. And that was so heartbreaking and devastating to see that without even thinking about the humanity of these people who may have just been a person with a broken leg, they were immediately discarded. They were called the invalids, and they were the first to go to the gas chambers. Seeing that made me realize that the brutality of the Nazi regime at Auschwitz is the mentality is still present with us, and how we disregard people who we don't view as productive or mainstream or visually appealing. Like the ugly laws that you mentioned that might sort of challenge our idea of what's normal, this sort of TV land picture we have of what's normal, and how those attitudes are still there. And I think part of the rolling back of support from various federally funded sources around the world, not just in the United States, is also saying those people are undeserving, that there are all these undeserving people out there whether they're kids with AIDS in Africa or they're people that aren't served by public education that need some more support, that somehow they're undeserving and we shouldn't do anything for them. And if we can somehow gradually eliminate them from view and maybe from the world, the world will look the way we want it to. And it really frightens me to think um, that we can look. I think we can generally agree. I hope so anyway. That Nazi Germany was the worst thing of our recent human history that we've ever done. I think there's a general agreement. Even
Absolutely, far and
yeah, I
wide.
have to be careful because apparently Trump has read Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography. So I have to be careful by saying everybody. But I think the most of us, conservative, liberal, can kind of agree that that is the worst we've ever done to ourselves. The problem is the seed of that idea, the dehumanization and the othering and the fear of things that make us feel personally uncomfortable. That's still very much a part of the world that we're in, and I feel those people have the floor right now, including the White House.
Right, the White House, and I'll sign it like white people, White House. Yeah, it really is, unfortunately, very much the White House. Now, I've been to some historical talks about the Holocaust, including some deaf people who suffered through the Holocaust. And there's so much that we have to learn from them. And especially in the deaf community, the way that deaf people were treated back then is not widely known. A friend of mine's grandmother actually went to the Holocaust Museum and didn't even last 2 minutes, but
Yeah,
felt sick to their stomach and had to leave. But
yeah.
for you to actually be in Auschwitz, physically be there and see all of that is just incredible.
It
I think
was
I'm not even sure that I
yeah,
could tolerate spending much time on those
yeah.
grounds if I were
It
my
was
kids.
it was overwhelming because you saw it's not one person, it's not Hitler. It was many, many people, including many soldiers, community members. There was a giant effort to exterminate people, and then they built Auschwitz II, Birkenau, right next door to it, which we also visited, and it was even worse there, where as the trains would come in, anybody who was too small to work, they threw them in burning pits, including babies. And it is just unimaginable, but we have to imagine it. We have to imagine it happened, and there were people who were 20th century people who knew about science, who had values, who grew up in faith traditions like Christianity, who were people very much like us, who were pitching babies into open fire. It's so to think that that could not happen again is a very problematic belief because the people who were the victims of that thought there's no way this could happen. There's no way this could happen. They thought at the last minute there's no way this is going to happen in the 20th century, and many of those people perished.
There's a book I read called Blinced by Norm Fritz, something like that. But it's a very good book about a Nazi soldier, actually, and how they drugged some of the soldiers. This soldier was
Uh,
given meth every single day in hospital. And so the book is called Blitzed, I think. And so it talks a lot about the history and what actually happened. And it was written in conjunction with some Americans and some Germans, but they talked a lot about how the drugs actually numbed people to the point where they were able to forget their values and do these horrible, horrible things.
yeah, yeah. It is very close. We still have people who are alive now who lived through it. So it's not ancient history. And there are versions of that that have happened in the Rohingya in Burma and in Rwanda, in Africa. I mean, we have had versions of this. People, can make the argument about Gaza as a form of genocide. I mean, we have this capacity, so we can't treat it as a historical story. That it's a constant um, struggle or battle or thing that we're focusing on, not making sure it doesn't happen, including here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Darfur.
Right.
Actually, I think I wrote a paper for your class on
Yes.
Darfur.
Yes.
Um, and that was one of the places actually that really brought home that modern day genocide for me.
Yeah. We
Now,
have
another
that
thing I wanted,
capacity.
yep, absolutely. Another question I wanted to ask you is about healthcare. So we know what is happening with Medicaid and Medicare and the concern that people are having, the threat to Medicaid and Medicare, and the impact that that will have. Would you consider that a hate crime? I think people don't take it seriously enough, but if Medicaid and Medicare are to go away or have significant cuts, to me, that's a hate crime. And I'm wondering how we can help people overcome this deficit thinking and and protect this lifeline. Is this legalized hate? Is there a parallel here to Nazi extremism?
Yeah, there's definitely a parallel. It's not a hate crime in the way that we define hate crime as a crime motivated by hate, but it has an impact on people who have been marginalized, who have been devalued, who have been seen as less than. So the impetus, the value comes from the same place of trying to remove people who are expendable from society and not seeing them as worthy of our attention or our tax dollars. And there is a profit motive. I mean, I want to just be frank and say that there is a economic benefit from cutting some people loose and freeing that money up for private health care. And then that money goes into the pockets of pharmaceutical companies and hospital builders. And so there is a real danger of creating more of a divide between the rich and the poor, this sort of wealth gap that we get. In other countries where they have some nationalized health care, not only is healthcare a right and not a privilege, but you also see the general public being closer together in terms of income levels. Because as we know, medical debt can wipe families out in this country, that the cost of healthcare can be so great that unless you're uh, rich and have great Cadillac healthcare insurance, you can be poor very quickly with one sickness in the family. But there are people who will profit from that, just like the people who profit off the painkiller industry, the people who profit off the cancer treatment industry. And so there's sort of two evils at work here. One is how we devalue certain categories of people and say they're not worthy of our care. But the other evil is the fact that there's a lot of money to be made by creating a system that's more privatized.
You're absolutely right. And I myself am dependent on Medicare, Medicaid, and so this hits very close to home for me. I've had several heart attacks, and so if they cut my Medicaid, I don't know what I'll do. I'm so dependent on that for my health. So we need to fight for human rights, period.
Yes.
All right. I think I'm just about done with my questions, but I do, if we have time, have a community question that was sent to me. Do you have a little bit extra time?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the question is about ADA. And how do you see ADA and DEIA, the fight against DEIA, impacting ADA and the fight for civil rights for people covered by the ADA in the future?
That's a very good question, and it actually relates a little bit to the last part of our conversation in that the ADA, on one side, creates opportunities and opens doors, literally, physically widens doors, so people can get in and we can have a more robust, rich workforce and community where more people are involved. That's a good thing. And we know that that's a good thing, not just because it's more inclusive and brings people in instead of pushing them away, but we all benefit, including able people benefit from being in that diverse environment. The other side of it is some of the requirements of the ADA cost money. They cost money in the design of buildings. They cost money in the planning of programs to make sure they're accessible to everyone. And at the front end of it, there has been pushback. There have been buildings that have had to been redesigned because they didn't include ramps for wheelchairs, for example, or the doors were too narrow. Uh, but the good news is when we talk about the benefit of the ADA, we can talk about it for the benefit of disability communities, but we can also talk about it for the benefit of everybody in general. For example, I kind of like closed captioning on some of my TV shows, especially if they have a thick English accent. If they've got closed captioning, that's a good thing. I benefit from being able to gain access to buildings that have ramps and have more doors. You know, we all sort of benefit from the ADA requirement. So when we start having that conversation about how the ADA actually helps everyone, not just specific communities with disabilities, people are more recipient to it. Instead of it being us versus them, it's back to us. And I think that's the message in general is when we're talking about DEI, people want to think about it as the DEI hire. Oh, that woman was hired because of DEI, or that person of color was promoted. No, this is something that benefits all of us. And we know that workforces that are more not only just diverse, but people feel safe and included are more productive. They get the job done. They make more money. They are safer. That where people feel safe and they can participate with everybody else, including the straight white males, the machine just works better. So part of this conversation is convincing those people who are just think DEIA is taking away their right and their power to say, no, actually, it's benefiting you in multiple ways. And I think that conversation is something that we need to be better at doing, is saying how we all benefit from DEIA. I think letting people know that it makes our lives richer and more profitable uh, can convince some of those people to say, "Oh, wait a second, this is something important that I need to support."
You know, this week, Gallaudet University is celebrating the anniversary of Deaf President Now from 1988, which was an impetus for the ADA. And that was part of the pressure on the government to actually sign the ADA.
Wow.
And actually, there's a documentary that'll be released soon on Apple TV about Gallaudet and the Deaf President Now protest. So I highly encourage everyone to watch that. But it documents the protest, the week-long protest that we called DPN in 1988. So I highly suggest if you have access to Apple TV that you watch that. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Randy, and for this interview. I hope you have a great day.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.